Here's the reading for pages 459 to 466, and we start with part 4, chapter 2, and check out the picture there. And we are on the rise of Islam. While Christianity was spreading in Europe and the Byzantine Empire was rising to glory around the Mediterranean Sea, something momentous was happening in the land known as Arabia. It all started with the teachings of a man named Muhammad. Muhammad brought to the people of Arabia a message about God, a message that would form the core of a new religion called Islam. In a short while, the followers of Islam, known as Muslims, were spreading their beliefs throughout much of the Mediterranean world and beyond. Muslims would go on to establish one of the greatest empires and civilizations in history. The Muslim empire is long gone, but the religion founded by Muhammad is thriving. There are more than 1 billion Muslims today, many in Asia and Africa, but also in Europe and the Americas, indeed around the world. Look at the map on page 460, which shows the parts of the world where Islam has more followers than any other religion. So this is the map, Muslims in the Eastern Hemisphere. And you can see if you take a look at the key, the dark yellow. Okay, and let's go back here and finish the reading though. To understand how Islam began and grew so rapidly, we need to travel back to the 6th century and visit the Arabian Peninsula, a crossroads between Asia, Africa, and Europe, the land of the desert. The Arabian Peninsula, also known as Arabia, lies southeast of Europe and northeast of Africa. Since ancient times, a people known as the Arabs have lived there. They sometimes call their land the Island of the Arabs. It's not really an island, of course, but salt water does surround much of it. The Mediterranean Sea to the northwest, the Red Sea to the west, and the Arabian Sea to the southeast, and the Persian Gulf to the east. So here's the Arabian Peninsula, and so there's the Mediterranean there, there's the red there, the Persian Gulf here. Okay. While the land is surrounded by bodies of salt water, there is a little fresh water to be found. The Great Arabian Desert stretches across much of the peninsula's 1 million square miles. The desert is a land of extremes. So there's a picture right there. In the day, the sun blazes mercilessly, and the temperatures can climb to 120 degrees Fahrenheit or more. At night, stars fill the sky, and in some places, the thermometer can drop to freezing or below. Many parts of the desert average only 2 or 3 inches of rainfall in a year. The peninsula is streaked with riverbeds, but for much of the year they are dry. In these dry riverbeds called wadis, water sometimes flows for short periods, but only after an infrequent rain. Most of the time, people can use the wadis as roads for crossing the desert. In the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, intense winds sweep across the ground. Stones and pebbles cover the desert surface, with a few thin patches of grass appearing here and there. Farther south, the desert is sandy. There, winds blow the sand into dunes that look like huge waves, some piled as high as 700 feet. A vast region in the southeast, roughly the size of Texas, is called the Rub al-Khali, or empty quarter. It contains the largest unbroken area of desert sand on Earth. When fierce winds whip across the desert, sand fills the air and gets into everything: shoes, shirts, pockets, hair, eyes, ears, mouths. People caught in sandstorms can hardly see or breathe. It is said that whole armies have been lost and buried beneath the sand. Little wonder that the people who manage to live in the Arabian desert are tough, resourceful people. On the map below, locate the Arabian Peninsula. Find the Arabian Peninsula on a globe as well. And on the map below, locate the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Persian Gulf. Note the areas that receive the least and most rainfall. So let's see here, the average annual rainfall. So that's what this map is about. And here you can see the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and this is that Arabian Peninsula. Okay, we've got desert up here, Ruba Khali, right there. So less than 4 inches. So it looks like the most of this gets less than 4 inches. And then you've got some with, the darker it is, the more rain it gets. Okay, so in some of these areas, but it's a lot of desert area. Lots and lots of desert area there. Okay, let's see. The people of the desert. Since the days of the Roman Empire, a people called Bedouin have made a home of the Arabian desert. The Bedouin of ancient times were nomads, continually moving from place to place in search of sparse vegetation and water. Their herds of livestock traveled with them and provided most of the things they needed. The Boudin got milk and cheese from their goats. They lived in tents made of camel or goat hair mixed with plant fibers. For clothing, they used camel hair and the wool of sheep. The Boudin were divided into many tribes that spoke the same language, but were otherwise independent. The tribes often feuded with each other. Being loyal to one's tribe, no matter what, was a code of the desert life. In defense of his tribe, an Arab would kill or be killed. Tribal members helped each other survive the harsh desert climate. The greatest disaster that could befall a desert Arab was to be turned out of his tribe. Not all Arabs were nomads. Here and there, the deserts were marked by oases, fertile places where there is usually a water supply, such as a natural spring. An oasis was one of those rare spots in the desert where people could settle down, grow food, and build towns. And in a few parts of the Arabian Peninsula, enough rain fell for farmers to grow grain and sweet-smelling spices. Farmers who wished to trade for their harvests could send their products away by caravan. Merchants in caravans, groups of people traveling across the desert, used camels to carry their goods, such as ivory from Africa, rubies from India, silk from China, and spices from Arabia. The caravan routes threaded across the parched land in all directions, leading to Egypt, Persia, the Byzantine Empire, and beyond. Traders always had to be on the lookout for desert tribes who might swoop down from the dunes and raid a caravan or demand payment for safe passage. Crossing the desert was treacherous business, but along the routes lay the oases where travelers could stop, rest, and trade their goods. Some oases grew to be bustling centers of commerce. They were crossroads for people, products, and ideas. The most important of these towns was Mecca. On the map on page 461, find Mecca. So if we come back here, okay, we can see Mecca right there. All right, the early life of Muhammad. In the 6th century, the city of Mecca was both a thriving center of trade and a busy center of worship. In those days, most Arabs were polytheists. They worshipped many gods who were believed to dwell in stones, wells, springs, and trees. Each tribe had its own god, who was usually said to live in a natural stone or an idol carved of stone. The gods and goddesses represented by these idols were believed to be powerful deities, so of course people wanted to keep them happy. One stone had become especially important to the Arabs, a meteoric black stone around which worshippers danced to gain divine favor. The Arabs placed this stone and others in a cube-shaped building called the Kaaba. Once each year, tribesmen from all over Arabia traveled to Mecca to honor the stone gods and ask them for protection. Mecca was one of the few places where during this time of pilgrimage, tribal feuds were set aside and people could worship their gods in peace. It was in this city that Muhammad was born around the year AD 570. We know few facts about his early life. His childhood was clouded with sadness. His father died before Muhammad was even born, and his mother died when he was only 6 years old. Muhammad spent the first 5 years of his life among wandering shepherds. After his mother's death, Muhammad was first cared for by his grandfather and then by an uncle. Like other Arab boys, he probably tended sheep, camels, and goats. They may also have traveled on caravan journeys with his uncle. In Mecca and along the caravan routes, he would have heard people of different faiths talk about their beliefs. When Muhammad was almost 25, his uncle gave him some advice. He had heard about a rich widow who was sending a caravan to Syria. He urged Muhammad to go to the widow and ask for work. The widow hired Muhammad. She had many caravans, and Muhammad journeyed with them to far-off cities, where he saw more of the world than he had ever known before. During his travels, Muhammad did more than sell spices and fine wool. He met all sorts of people, kept his ears open, and absorbed new ideas. He met Jewish people who told him that they believed in only one God. He met Christians who told him about Jesus and his teachings. As he traveled slowly across the desert, he pondered all he had seen and heard. Soon, Muhammad married the wealthy widow. Now that he had a secure income, he could spend more time considering what he had seen and heard. He hated the fact that the tribes in his land often fought with each other. Too often, people seemed to think only of themselves. Most didn't try to help the poor or the sick. Muhammad was troubled by their behavior. Is this the right way to live? He asked himself. Could there be a better way? The more he thought, the more he believed that the stone gods could not give him the answer. Vision in a cave. Muhammad often spent time in the hills around Mecca, where he could be alone with his thoughts. When he was about 40 years old, he retreated to a cave, where he had a vision. Muhammad said that an angel called Gabriel appeared to him. This is how Muhammad later described it. The angel Gabriel came to me while I was asleep. He was carrying a piece of embroidered cloth, and on the cloth there was writing. He told me to recite. I told him I did not know what to recite. Then suddenly the angel caught me and pressed me to him so hard I thought I was going to die. In the end, Muhammad found that he could recite the angel's message. It was as though some words were written on his heart. The words were, "Recite in the name of your Lord." Then words seemed to flow from Muhammad's mouth as he received the first of what Muslims believe were many revelations from God. Muhammad spent the rest of his life preaching to the Arabs. Gradually, he came to the conclusion that his mission was to be the prophet of Allah. Allah is the Arabic word for God. Muhammad told the people of Mecca that they were foolish to believe in many gods. Allah alone created the universe, he said, and Allah alone rules it. On the day of judgment, Allah will look at your life and reward or punish you. He wants you to be generous and share with the poor. He wants you to stop worshiping many gods and worship only Allah. Let's go back to this part over here, depicting the prophet. In religious art, Muslims avoid depicting the faces of religious figures because to do so, they believe, is to encourage people to worship images instead of Allah alone. If a Muslim artist depicts the Prophet Muhammad or another important religious figure, he will cover the face with a veil or with the image of a flame, as in the illustration on this page, as well as later in this book. So you can see here. Okay. All right. Muhammad told people that they must give up their careless ways of living. Instead, they should surrender their whole unmixed loyalty to Allah. From Muhammad's message came the name of a new religion, Islam. Islam is the Arabic word for submission or surrendering one's whole self to God. Muhammad's followers became known as Muslims. Muslim means one who submits. Muslims believe they should submit their lives and thoughts to the will of Allah. Muhammad never said that he was himself divine. He didn't claim the power to perform miracles. Rather, he said he was a prophet who brought a message from Allah to a world full of strife and bloodshed. The flight from Mecca. Muhammad did not start out on his mission with the idea of establishing a new religion. He simply wanted the Arabs to give up their stone gods and worship the one true God, the same God that the Jews and Christians worshipped. For a while, the people of Mecca considered Muhammad harmless enough. But the more he preached, the more Arab leaders turned against him. They didn't like being told they were foolish and ignorant and that their gods were not real. Besides, Meccans made a great deal of money from the thousands of Arabs who journeyed every year to worship their tribal idols at the Kaaba. All the business would disappear if pilgrims stopped coming to honor the old gods. As Muhammad began to attract a little band of believers, troubles mounted. Mecca's rulers worried they might lose their power and riches, so they came up with a terrible plan to kill Muhammad and be rid of him forever. When Muhammad heard about the plot, he had to make a hard decision. Should he stay in Mecca or should he travel to another city in Arabia where more people would listen to him? In 622, he decided to leave his birthplace and move to Medina, a city some 200 miles to the north. On the map on page 461, locate Medina. Okay, and on 461, here's Mecca, and there's Medina. So that's about 200 miles. The journey to Medina was full of hazards. When Muhammad's enemies discovered that he was gone, they were furious. Soldiers from Mecca raced across the desert on their fastest horses, determined to catch and kill this troublemaker before he could get away. To elude his pursuers, Muhammad traveled during the darkest hours and hid during the day. Muhammad's flight to Medina, called the Hijra, became a turning point in the history of Islam. Hijra is the Arabic word for migration. For Muslims, the departure from Mecca marks the beginning of the Islamic era. In the same way that the Christian calendar marks dates from the birth of Christ, the Hijra marks the first year of the Muslim calendar. And that will be the end of our reading for pages 459 to 466.